really pleased to be with you all and to share some of the work of the World Justice Project and my own observations and thoughts on our topic today. I thought I would start out with a brief presentation of the World Justice Project's data on the rule of law globally. So WJP annually publishes a rule of law index, which measures the rule of law in 128 countries and evaluates their respect for rule of law principles and gives them a score and a ranking against each other. So if you'll bear with me, I'll share my screen and some slides that can illustrate what the data show about the state of the rule of law in the world today. See here. All right, can everybody see my slides?
Yes, I think you're good.
Great. As I mentioned, the World Justice Project has developed a rule of law index, which measures the rule of law globally. We have a mantra, which we like to say, just measure it, change it. And so that's what we do with this rule of law index. It actually was begun as a project of the American Bar Association back in 2007. Bill Newcomb was president of the ABA, and as his presidential initiative set out to convene experts to develop a rigorous and globally resonant definition of the rule of law. We talk about this concept a lot, but we need to anchor it in a definition and a methodology for measuring it. And that was how the index was developed and launched. So it's really a child of the American Bar Association. I'm having a hard time. I'm going to stop sharing that. For some reason it's not progressing to the next screen. Let me try this one. Okay, there we go. So a word about the methodology and the definition that is reflected in the WJP Rule of Law Index. The rule of law is this broad concept, and through this work that we did back, starting with Bill's year as ABA president, we developed a definition that broke it down into 9 different factors of the rule of law that are reflected here. And those really on the top reflect limitations on government power, and those on the bottom really reflect obligations of government to their citizens. We found it quite helpful to disaggregate this capacious concept of the rule of law in these factors in order to facilitate analysis of specific issues and problems and to identify corresponding needed reform. Within each of the factors, then we have broken the concept down even further into subfactors. And so you can see some of those illustrated here. In factor 1, constraints on government powers, for example, that is broken down into the different kinds of mechanisms in which government powers might be constrained by the legislature or the judiciary, auditors, and other kinds of oversight bodies, and so on. As I mentioned, we undertake this research in 128 countries in order to develop the measure of each country's performance on these factors and subfactors. The methodology relies on surveys, and it's primarily 2 sets of surveys. One is an expert survey of practicing lawyers and other professionals in each country. That's distributed broadly. And in fact, we just launched this year's data collection today in surveys of practitioners all over the world. And those who are on the call might be interested in participating. We welcome, if you're a practicing lawyer in a jurisdiction we are studying, we'd be happy to have you complete the survey. In addition to the expert survey, there's also a household survey that asks people in each country, typically 1,000 households per country, representative of the national population, asking them how are they experiencing the law in their country. And this is quite important. There are lots of other studies that evaluate the laws on the books, but it's through this people-centered approach that we are able to garner particularly helpful data, insightful data about how the law is operating in people's everyday lives. The surveys ask people things, for example, have they been solicited for a bribe in the past year? What have their interactions with the police been in the last year? And so on. Together, these two survey instruments generate over 500 variables in each, data on 500 variables in each country. And then those are crunched by statistics experts, not the lawyers, to develop the scores on each of the different factors and subfactors. So let me just share with you what the key findings and trends are that are revealed in the WJP Rule of Law Index 2020, which we published last March. Here are the top performers and the bottom performers. And you can see also what movement there was in their rank in the final column there, as well as percentage score changes in the third column, both for the top 10 and the bottom 10. Overall, the WJP Rule of Law Index 2020 showed that more countries declined than improved in overall rule of law performance for a third year in a row, continuing a negative slide toward weakening and stagnating rule of law around the world. And you can see that reflected here in a heat map. If you look at the key at the bottom, you can see that the red or yellow countries are declining. And if you go toward blue, the warmer blue, those are the improving countries. So definitely more countries declining than improving. And you can see we've highlighted with the labels some of the countries where the biggest changes were seen between 2019 and 2020. But one of the things that was remarkable, we had seen this decline over several years, year over year, but in the past year, I think for the first time, we saw that this decline was really widespread and seen in all corners of the world. In every region, a majority of countries slipped backward or remained unchanged in their overall rule of law performance since 2019 study. At a global level, the highest levels of decline over the past year were seen in the areas of fundamental rights, constraints on government powers, and absence of corruption. You can see here in this chart across the 8 of the 9 factors, we do not score countries on informal justice. We measure it, but it is relevant only in some countries, not in all countries. And so for the global rankings and scores, we exclude that data. So here you see the 8 factors, and you can see both in the solid bar, the change over the past year, and in the hashed bar, the change over the last 5 years. So in the past year, fundamental rights, 54 countries declined, 29 improved. On constraints on government powers, 52 declined, 28 improved. And in absence of corruption, 51 declined and 26 improved. And you can see then if you compare the 2019 to 2020 period to the last 5 years, that this is not a new pattern. WJP data shows the same 3 factors: fundamental rights, constraints on government powers, and absence of corruption were the largest decliners over that 5-year period. So we start to see a pretty persistent and negative trend. Fundamental rights showed the greatest backsliding over this 5-year period, with 67 countries declining in the score since 2015.
So Betsy,
yes, sure.
I'll bet you're leading into this, but I'm sure I wasn't the only one who was surprised to see the US was not a notable decliner last year. Does the US show up as a notable decliner on the 5-year span?
It is definitely a decliner. And it depends on how you define notable, and the kind of percentage cutoff. As you can appreciate, rule of law changes are often incremental. Small percentage changes over time. So often year to year, we don't see big changes unless there's a regime change, then you see a big change. But typically year over year, we see just marginal changes. But then over a 5-year period, yes, significant declines. In the United States, I don't have it at my fingertips. The overall score was over 5 years, not so significant, but in constraints on government powers, factor 1, we've seen an over 10% decline since 2016. So that is quite notable in that factor area. Other data relevant to the US it slipped from out of the top 20 in the past year. For the first time, it fell to 21 and was replaced in the top 20 by Spain. It is now, as I say, 21 between France at 20 and Ecuador at 22. And this has been a persistent trend for a number of years in its overall score. The top performers globally are Denmark, Norway, and Finland. And that has been consistent over a number of years. And the lowest overall rule of law scores are found in Venezuela, Cambodia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the same top 3 and same bottom 3 as 2019. In 2020, the countries that showed the strongest improvement, really emphasizing my point about regime change, and that's where we see the big jumps, were Ethiopia, which improved by 5.6%, and Malaysia by 5.1%. The largest decline in the rule of law was seen in Cameroon and Iran. You can explore, I am a little hesitant to share this before we're done talking because it may be distracting, but there's a really fun interactive website where you can explore all this data. I think it's more fun than my kids' computer games to look at all of this data from on a factor and subfactor level and see which countries are moving up and moving down each area, and where they fall vis-a-vis other countries in their income and regional groupings. The US, to your point, Michael, and I think this is sometimes shocking to people who think of the US as a real beacon of the rule of law, but we have some very significant challenges, particularly in the criminal justice system and discrimination in our civil and criminal justice system, where we rank, around 100 out of 128 versus, the top tier. The US at the sub-factor level is below its regional or income group on all but the first 2 factors, that is constraints on government power and absence of corruption. So that's pretty striking too, that falling below its factor, its cohort in so many areas. So let me, I guess one last word, I'll stop sharing about the data before turning to you, Michael, to make sense of it, is that this data that I've shared with you is 2020 data. It's our 2020 report. However, we launched this report on March 11th. It was actually the last thing that I did in person with my colleagues at WJP before the pandemic. And so what we are quite interested to find in the new data collection that we're just launching today is the impact of COVID. What we know from from other studies, from data emerging from other institutions, as well as just reporting coming out and monitoring of legal developments globally, is that the pandemic has posed very real challenges to the rule of law. So we expect declining scores across many of the factors that we measure, particularly in constraints on government powers and fundamental rights, and corruption. The very same areas that have been threatened for the last several years are those that are where we have particular vulnerabilities in the context of the pandemic. So we see emergency laws across the board enacted that are sometimes being used opportunistically by those leaders with an authoritarian bent to yet amass greater powers to erode the constraints on government authority, to bypass parliaments which can't meet, for example, or audit agencies which have a difficult time carrying out in-person audit under these circumstances. The media has been hampered in playing its role. We even see, of course, abuse of technology. And on the one hand, technology can really help with contact tracing and the like to curb the pandemic, but that also, of course, threatens erosion of privacy rights, as just a few examples of the areas where we see threats. Finally, corruption is, of course, another area with massive flows of resources, both in response to the health crisis and the economic crisis. And again, audit functions being suspended because of the emergency is rife for abuse. And so we anticipate seeing really concerning trends in those areas. So that is the challenging state of the rule of law in the world today. And I'm eager to hear your thoughts about how we got here, Michael, and how we might get out. There's certainly very interesting dynamics in which rule of law at the international level feeds into these domestic developments that I've described, and vice versa. It's almost like a pandemic itself, this rule of law crisis. And so thinking about how we might, through the recovery, reverse those trends and get ourselves on a more virtuous cycle is an interesting challenge. And over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Betsy. I just adore how rigorous and well thought out your treatment of rule of law is. It's just a term that's thrown around every day by everyone, including President Trump, and has many, many different meanings. One thing that did surprise me is, we have such a sense of crisis in the US. I mean, does it say to you that maybe there ought to be some gestalt measure on your questionnaires in addition to the 100 odd subfactors? Do you think that it failed to capture something? When you think about the Inspector General purge and the intervention of the DOJ in the Roger Stone case, and on and on and on and on and on, and the emoluments.
It won't surprise you that I'll defend the data. And I think it actually can be a pretty helpful check on our perceptions and our anxieties and how things are cast, and put it in perspective, both longitudinally and globally. Certainly there is a steady decline in the rule of law in the United States across multiple factors, and it is not small. And so, and that shows up in the data very clearly. But we're also starting from a position of relative strength, and there there are lots of different factors and dimensions here, and some things are working and some things are not.
There's this huge literature, both academic and popular, about democratic decline right now. of course, that's a distinct, maybe overlapping, maybe correlated concept. Do you think that democracy is more prone to sudden collapse than rule of law?
Hard to generalize about the rule of law ever, but it probably is. It's probably more of an erosion kind of a process than a collapse kind of a process. We tend to see the changes, both improvements and declines, occurring quite incrementally in our metrics. There's also, I should say, a delay. So we're doing the data collection now. The data that I've shared with you were collected a year ago. So they didn't pick up some of the developments that you were referencing that have occurred just in the last 6 months. Even though those last 6 months seem rather long, but it'll be interesting to see how they shape up this.
I suppose that the prior year there was at least the appearance of constraint in the impeachment hearings.
Yeah, I was interested in seeing the difference that between 2018 and 2019. Our 2018 data was before the midterm elections, right? And then the 2019 data after, the other way around. 2020 data was after the midterm elections. And I thought we would see maybe a slowing of the decline on constraints in government powers. Because now there would at least be the legislative check, but we didn't really see that effect.
Right, and it was really soon after the beginning of calendar 2020 that the Senate voted not to convict, and there was a perception that suddenly Trump felt liberated and emboldened, and that's not picked up. Okay, so thank you so much, ABA, for having us. So nice to be here with Betsy. So I'm taking on the outward direction of our title. I'm taking a look at how developments in the US have affected rule of law around the world. And for a variety, my approach is going to be completely unscientific. But I'm a journalist and I see the world through journalism eyes, and which is, to tell you the truth, not so much different than, for instance, an intelligence analyst. Right? I try to follow many developments and put them together into a narrative. And I'm going to plunge in. I have some prepared remarks. And would love to hear all of your questions after. So in his first and, God willing, only inaugural address, Donald Trump set forth a new right under international law. He called it the right of all nations to put their own interests first. Now, Hungary's Viktor Orban zeroed in on that phrase. Orban announced that Trump had given like-minded leaders permission to scorn international law and called it a great gift. I think that world events over the past 4 years, as well as events in Hungary, have proven Orban right. When Hungary drove Central European University out of the country, Trump's ambassador blamed George Soros. When Orban used COVID to impose rule by decree, the US scarcely made a peep. Last year, Trump honored Orban with a White House reception and called him a respected leader. A bit controversial, Trump said, but that's okay, that's okay. By word and deed, Trump gives a permission structure to international scofflaws. That's okay is the Trump doctrine of international law and human rights. On his first trip abroad, Trump met the King of Bahrain and pledged to stop straining their wonderful relationship. 2 days later, Bahraini security agents opened fire on a crowd of protesters, killing 5 and wounding over 100. As they tortured dissidents later that week, according to the dissidents' testimony, Two of the security agents, the interrogators, boasted, "The US president has changed, and from now on, we will do with you what we want. Do you know that we have a green light from Trump?" Authoritarians know they have a green light from Trump. When US diplomats complained about repression in Cambodia, the military dictator Hun Sen retorted that Trump supports him and asked Trump to rein his embassy in. Interestingly, I heard almost exactly the same anecdote, except it was polluting factory managers telling EPA inspectors, you know, go scram, the president backs us. At last year's G20, Trump reportedly told Xi Jinping that detaining Uyghurs was exactly the right thing to do. In a phone call with Xi the same month, Trump reportedly promised to keep silent about the suppression of democracy in Hong Kong. We hear less about India stripping Kashmir of autonomy because Narendra Modi also switched off the internet. But Trump was just as happy to give that a green light. A month after the Kashmir lockdown, he held a mass rally in Houston in honor of Narendra Modi called Howdy Modi. While Europe has treated Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro as an environmental pariah for wrecking the Earth's lungs, Trump tweeted, "He is working very hard on the Amazon fires and in all respects doing a great job. He and his country have the full and complete support of the USA. Keep on fanning the flames." That'll be my last attempt at a Seth Meyers Donald Trump impression. So a Trumpian cry of fake news has become every autocrat's all-purpose response to media criticism. Fake news has been used to wave away reports of Syrian prison deaths, Libyan slave auctions, Malaysian kickbacks, and whatever the press criticized yesterday in Brazil. When the UN Security Council demanded an explanation for the Rohingya expulsion, the Burmese commander-in-chief repeated the phrase fake news a dozen times. Russia's foreign ministry simply labels any story it dislikes with a red, all caps, fake stamp. I don't have any PowerPoint sound effects. Trump's first trip abroad, which I mentioned before, is best remembered for the glowing orb photo with the Saudi and Egyptian leaders. Like the king of Bahrain, Hamad, Mohammed bin Salman and Abdullah Sisi used Trump's blessing to crush their opposition when they got home. Later, after visiting the White House in 2018, they grew bolder. Sisi amended the Constitution to entrench military control and prolong his rule by 15 years. MBS rounded up feminists and ordered the dismemberment of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Trump responded by approving the transfer of nuclear technology to Riyadh, secretly, we learned later, and openly vetoing a bipartisan congressional resolution under the War Powers Act against the war in Yemen, which many regard as the world's greatest humanitarian crisis today. The dismemberment of nations does not bother Donald Trump either. On Syria's southwestern border, Trump recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. On Syria's northeastern border, Trump withdrew US troops and potentially cleared way for Turkey to ethnically cleanse the Syrian Kurds. Asked to comment on Russia's invasion of Crimea, the president said during his campaign, he repeated a Russian talking point and said that the people would rather be with Russia. During his time in office, he blocked his own administration's efforts to criticize the invasion on its 10th anniversary. And he has repeatedly called on the G7 to reverse the suspension of their suspension of Russia, which was the main international community consequence before the carving up of Ukraine. Trump is also indifferent to the principle of democratic succession. He gave Turkey's Recep Erdogan high marks after consolidating power. He congratulated Putin on his sham re-election despite his briefing papers begging him, do not congratulate, all caps. And his response to Xi Jinping becoming president for life was, I think it's great. And something on the order of maybe we should try that ourselves someday. A lesser known but telling example is the president of Honduras. Juan Hernandez was internationally condemned for rigging his own re-election in November 2017. That December, Honduras defended the US at the UN for recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. 6 days later, the US congratulated Hernandez on his re-election. Fait accompli. Central America also shows Trump's cynicism about corruption. During the Obama era, the OAS and the UN had installed tough anti-corruption bodies in both Honduras and Guatemala. This January, Honduras let theirs expire. That came a mere 10 days after the US praised Honduras for, among other things, taking back US asylum seekers. It will surprise no one to learn that President Hernandez has since been accused of taking money from narco traffickers, but there was no one left to follow through. Honduras's Northern Triangle neighbor, Guatemala, has followed a remarkably similar pattern. As a tough global corruption body investigated its president, the country curried favor with Trump by taking back asylum seekers and backing the US on Israel policy. In fact, Guatemala one-upped Honduras. Outside the US, Guatemala was the world's only nation to move its own embassy to Jerusalem. The payback time came in August 2018. That month, President Jimmy Morales paraded US-donated military jeeps past the UN Corruption Office in Guatemala and announced that it was closing. In a characteristic profile of courage, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tweeted the next day, "Our relationship with Guatemala is important." Trump later thanked Morales in the Oval Office for enabling the US to, quote, "get rid of dangerous people who don't belong here. Guatemala is terrific," he bubbled. Finally, Trump has no problem with extrajudicial killings. In 2017, he praised Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines for doing a great, unbelievable job in gunning down 6,000 suspected drug dealers, or in some cases, drug users. The same year, Kim Jong-un of North Korea publicly poisoned his half-brother with nerve gas on suspicion of being a CIA informant. Trump suggested that the CIA should never have recruited Kim's brother and gushed about the beautiful warm letter Kim had just sent him. Trump has been denying Putin's trail of dead critics since he began running for office. In 2018, Trump tried to rescind his administration's sanctions for the Sergei Skripal poisoning and said that the US was being too tough on Putin. Even after Germany concluded this fall that Putin had poisoned Alexei Navalny, Trump denied there was proof. If cornered with proof, Trump can always deflect a human rights question with moral equivalence. Told that Putin was a confirmed killer, Trump responded, "There are a lot of killers. Do you think our country is so innocent?" With respect to assassination, at least, Trump answered that question definitively by killing Iran's General Soleimani way back at the beginning of this long year. So the Atlantic Monthly's Adam Server famously said of Trump's immigration policy, "The cruelty is the point." On international law, cynicism is the point. The cynicism is the point. Asked about our abuses, Trump says, "What about them?" Asked about their abuses, he says, "What about us?" As Viktor Orban perceived on day one, the Trumpian ideal is a world with no role models, where every autocrat has permission to do as he pleases. Thank you very much.
Wow, Michael, thank you. That was really a tour of the world and of some horrors, and quite sobering. I guess I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask before we open it up to everybody. And one is what you've described here is a bunch of bilateral impacts, right? Of the Trump administration's approach to human rights and how that plays out in its bilateral relations and the behavior of other states. I'm wondering to what extent you've also tracked the multilateral impact. So of the positions taken by this administration vis-a-vis major multilateral institutions, the International Criminal Court, the UN, human rights bodies, and so on. And how is that cycle playing?
Well, that's another long session. Yeah, absolutely. The first piece I wrote under Trump was called the Treaty Undoing Project, and last year I did a feature called President at the Destruction that tried to measure to what extent he's followed through on his ambition to dismantle the world order, and my personal conclusion is that he's been exceptionally successful. There is a difference of opinion about that. My favorite book on that is was co-written by Ivo Dalder. But of course, my feature covers the first 3 years, and Dalder's book probably covers the first 2. And I would say in the years since, we've seen the promulgation of the inalienable rights doctrine and the imposition of sanctions on the International Criminal Court. And the day after election, I think win or lose, I think we are going to see the official withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. And looming in February, we have the expiration of the New START agreement. So the dismantling of the world order continues apace. The World Trade Organization has no functioning appellate body. Despite, I actually look back on my first column and I noticed that I said cheerily, well, Trump never has actually threatened to withdraw from the WTO or from NATO, but he has since. So, if that 12% chance in today's 538.com percentage comes true, forecast comes true, and Trump is reelected, there's really no telling where he might stop. And I think that he will, he has already, to a very significant degree, surrounded himself with yes men and got rid of the so-called adults in the room. And now he's going to get rid of the yes but men and replace them to yes, yes, yes men. So I'm terrified.
Okay, I definitely see what where you're coming from, and I was struck, and you mentioned the Inalienable Rights Commission, and I was struck when that report was issued around the same time. Of course, the European Union was putting rule of law related pressure on Hungary, and the Orban government announced that it would launch its own institute or commission to define and measure the rule of law. And it struck me as the same kind of move as the Inalienable Rights Commission, in terms of we're going to define the rules for ourselves. But I want to push you a little bit on the position that I think is implicit in your remarks, which is, this is really a Trumpian phenomenon. And I wonder to what extent some of the seeds of the challenges we're currently facing aren't longer term and a function of the US posture vis-a-vis international law and international human rights law, and the, I guess, ambivalence that we've had about that framework as being relevant and binding on us. And that,
well, I think the trend
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the trends certainly are longer term, and it was telling that Viktor Orban, who is more of a strategic thinker, I think understood the speech that Stephen Miller wrote for Donald Trump better than Donald Trump did, because people like Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, who was very much influential at that time, do see themselves as part of an international populist nationalist movement and trend. But what Orban recognized is that it was a huge breakthrough to suddenly have the world's hegemon, or the closest thing we still have to a hegemon, giving a permission structure for those rogue actors to follow their own interests. I mean, Stephen Miller in his draft of the inaugural called them national interests, but really they're the national interests as defined personally by the autocrats.
Great. Well, I could pepper you with more questions, but maybe we should take a few of our last minutes to field some questions from our audience. Kristen, do you want to pose those to us?
Sure.
Yes.
And if that lags, I've got lots more for Betsy too.
Okay, great. We'll start with the ones that are submitted. And a reminder to our participants, if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A box. We'll start with the first one. How can the US return to its prior higher standing in the rule of law ranking? And then there's, so it's the main question, I think, then there's a bit more details. Since the Constitution does not prevent the impeachment of presidents after leaving office, would an impeachment serve to demonstrate there are repercussions for obstruction of justice, tax fraud, campaign finance violations, etc.? At the very least, would this prevent the offender from running again and serve as a warning to other potential future leaders? And then maybe I'll ask the second one that we have too, and then kind of let you both take them. Second question is, what kind of factors determine changes in rule of law in terms of criminal justice specifically, since we've got a lot of criminal justice lawyers probably tuning into this program. So how do current criminal justice issues in the news, such as use of force, mass incarceration, racial disparities in the criminal justice system, et cetera, impact the rule of law? You know, obviously that we're talking about that a lot right now in the United States, but I think we're seeing that also play out a bit in other countries as well. So either way, and I'll, you can take one or both of those, either whatever you two want.
Right. Well, let's maybe they're quite distinct. So let's take them maybe one at a time. On the first one, yeah, the questioner focuses on accountability for Trump and crimes that may have been committed by him and his administration. And while I think accountability can be important in reinforcing the rule of law, it's really a cornerstone of the rule of law in any context. I don't think that you know, should there be investigation in crimes and jurisdiction and accountability possible there. I think it would be wrong to think that that's going to be a magic bullet for our rule of law in the United States. I think we've got some pretty big structural and longer term problems that we need to address. And maybe this has been a sufficient shock to the system that it is starting to be addressed. There you see civic engagement like we have probably in my lifetime, which is really important. And you know, you see political engagement, you see media accountability and growing, and so I think there's room for hope, but we may well need constitutional reform that will kind of upgrade our system, make elections more of a real check on authority, and more accurately reflect the will of the people. as one example. There have been lots of commissions and studies and blueprints and sets of recommendations that have been generated over the last several years. And I think following the election, there should probably be some very focused work on taking some of those ideas forward to reinforce our institutions and our norms. A lot of the rule of law checks and balances in the US are unwritten. And that has proven a vulnerability in recent periods. I was on a panel a couple of years ago with a colleague from South Africa, and we were talking about the rule of law in our countries and the challenges and how different actors and institutions were responding. And I was so jealous of her as she was describing their, much more modern constitution, which codified and created a much clearer set of norms and institutions that can check authority when it exceeds its proper bounds. And we may need to codify some of that has just been unwritten rules in our system.
Yeah, I agree totally. But I would say that the codification, to be practical, has to take the form of statute and not constitutional reform, because I think we're just too divided as a nation to come anywhere near ratifying an amendment. I think question 1B was, what about impeachment? I think one clear lesson of the last 4 years for me is that impeachment is worthless in as hyper-polarized a partisan environment as we have now, perhaps except under, extremely unusual political alignment. But, as long as the president's party has blocking power in one house of Congress, nothing is really going to result. I think the record of our special counsel investigation is mixed, and on the whole was probably more disappointing than not. That raises kind of the question of how robust and effective have the post-Watergate reforms proved to be. Last time we went through a crisis like this, we had an independent counsel statute passed, a whole ethics in government structure created, including inspectors general. I think, well, the independent counsel statute proper lapsed. Its informal successor, the special counsel, I think proved not quite adequate to the task for, maybe for a variety of very specific reasons. But I think that any good government reformer could get behind some sort of strengthening of the independence of a special counsel and removing it from the influence of the Justice Department. I think the set of constraining institutions that have fared best over the last 4 years are the inspectors general, who really, because they are required to at least notify Congress that a report exists, eventually gave way to the Ukraine whistleblower scandal that led to impeachment, if not conviction. At the same time, I do think that we could use a whole lot more insulation of the Inspector General's independence, because we have since seen, after the president's acquittal by the Senate, a purge of Inspectors General, which has been extremely disturbing. We've also, in the last week, seen some seriously disturbing civil service reform that promises a further purging of the lower ranks of the bureaucracy and a further politicization of the middle and lower ranks of the bureaucracy, something that we've seen in the State Department, the Justice Department, Homeland Security Department, the EPA, you name it. We have deeply, deeply politicized bureaucracies, and as Betsy observed, it's because we rely so heavily on norms rather than law to guard against their independence. And we now have, I think, in the Consumer Finance Regulation Board, whatever, the CFSB. You'll forgive my initials. In that Supreme Court ruling, we, depending on how broadly or narrowly the precedent is interpreted, the Supreme Court threatens to rein in Congress's efforts to create commissions that are more insulated from the executive and do it in a constitutional way that may make it hard to work around. So I think that HR 1 is extraordinary in doing absolutely everything it can on the democracy and voting rights front within the constraints of the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution. It does everything it can statutorily for voting rights and for democracy. At the edges, it works on ethics in government as well. For instance, it requires tax disclosures by the president and other senior officers. It requires divestments of assets that create conflicts of interest, responding to the emoluments concern. But I don't see the structural attention to constraints that I would love to see, kind of revisiting the post-Watergate reforms when it comes to insulating, fortifying the inspectors general and either an independent counsel or a special counsel or some equivalent, and in general, insulating and guarding the independence of the executive agencies and commissions.
Thank you both. Those answers, I think, give us a lot to think about, including kind of structural things that we can talk about moving forward in the legal profession. I'm going to just remind you the second question was, what kind of factors determine changes in rule of law in terms of criminal justice specifically? How do current criminal justice issues that are in the news, such as the use of force, mass incarceration, racial disparities in the criminal justice system, et cetera, impact the rule of law?
So as I mentioned in my opening presentation, the US does not perform very well in its criminal justice scores in our index. And that is, well, their weaknesses across the board, across the subfactors. But I would say what is the big drag, and this won't be any surprise to anyone on this call, it is discrimination in the system. And it's really quite striking. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but the disparities in experience of the criminal justice system based on race. And it's quite clear that there is a different rule of law for one cohort in our society and another. And so I think that's, from our analysis, the overwhelming factor that needs to be addressed. Now, how to go about that? Our data is only at a pretty general level in the United States, so it's a statistically significant sample of 1,000 households across the country, but that doesn't enable you to do the kind of diagnostic of problems that really play out at the very local level, at the county level, city level, across the country. So one of the projects that we are developing now is to do a more in-depth data collection that would enable us to look at variance in performance of various law enforcement actors at that local level, and then be able to identify good practices and less good practices. And we've done this work in Mexico, where we did an inmate survey of 65,000 inmates in the Mexican criminal justice system and asked them about their experience of the criminal justice system. It's fascinating data. We were able then to map the data to from when they were tried, when they were arrested, tried, and convicted, to when certain reforms were introduced in the country, and we're able to then see whether those reforms were having an impact. What we found was, in fact, they were in some areas, particularly with respect to the trial, that in the early period before the reforms, a vast number of criminal trials took place without a judge being present at the actual criminal trial. After the reform and introduction of a more adversarial process, judges started showing up, and generally inmates were more satisfied with their process. They accepted the verdict, even when it had been against them, as opposed to the case where they were all in prison. So this just highlights the benefits of data to get at the rather granular level to diagnose what's working and what's not, and drive kind of change that is needed in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I would absolutely second the proposition that structural racism is an important component of the absence of rule of law. And for proof, you need only look at the US government's US courts website, which actually lists equal enforcement as the first major component of rule of law, and also gives a special emphasis on hearing minority grievances. And to all of the things that the questioner and Betsy noted, I would throw in inequality in incarceration as another big structural problem that happily, I think, public opinion is shifting on, and public attention is focusing upon, and there is hope for progress. I wonder, I have a question stored up that I think helps tie together my half of the presentation with Betsy's. I wanted to throw it out. So Betsy.
Okay, maybe we'll end with that then.
Okay.
We'll end with your question. We're running short
Yeah,
on
so
time.
Betsy, you know, rule of law can be in the eye of the beholder. And I know you've done really great work tracking the use and abuse of the term by everyone under the sun, including Trump. So let me throw out at you a few choice uses of the phrase rule of law by our president. He said, well, here's a good one. He says, Republicans believe in the rule of law, not the rule of the mob. Vote Republican, all caps. He said, we must stand with the rule of law against the coup targeting at real Donald Trump. He said, the rule of law is our nation's proud heritage. The Senate has the chance to protect this glorious heritage by sending Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. And he also said, respect for the rule of law is at our country's core. We must build a wall. Okay, so if rule of law can be connected with every one of these assorted Trumpian priorities, then what does it mean? What does it mean for him, and what does it mean for us? How do you make sense of this?
Right. Well, this is, I'll be brief because we're out of time, but this is precisely what motivated the World Justice Project and the work to define and measure the rule of law in a rigorous way as a defense to this kind of abuse of the concept. But I think the real distinction you're seeing here play out is whether we're talking about rule of law or rule by law. And I think in many of the examples that you've cited, what we are really saying is rule by law. I want it my way, and the laws are good. I'm going to use the laws to get it, which is of course not the concept that is reflected in Magna Carta and other ancient documents. So that's the
maybe there's a conflation with law and order. Maybe there's a conflation with law and order as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So civic education, I think, is critical, and so go ABA, Public Ed Division, and of course the good work the Criminal Justice Section does in that score as well.